Anna?
Yeah.
Did you ask a question?
No, all good. We're going to start the webinar just in a minute.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Great.
Yes. Okay.
Thanks, Paul. Okay, let's get this show on the road. Good afternoon, good morning, and good day to you all. We're probably still waiting for quite a few participants, but we'll start already and hope they'll come join us over the next few minutes. Warm welcome to everyone. My name is Hannah Peters. I'm a researcher at Swedwatch, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. And on behalf of the organizers, Swedwatch, Source International, and Mighty Earth, I'd like to welcome you all to our online discussion today on the right to a healthy environment and safe drinking water throughout the agricultural commodity value chain, illustrated by the case of natural rubber. And before we start the discussion, and then maybe this also gives additional participants the time to join us, allow me some brief housekeeping remarks. Emphasis on brief. I know that this is very likely not your first Zoom webinar of this year or last year, for that matter. Just a quick note on the format. As I said, I'll be moderating the session today, and I'll be asking our four discussants, who I will introduce in a little bit, but whose names you can also see up on the welcome slide there, 2 rounds of questions. And the 2 rounds will then be followed by a question and answer session with all of you. And for that, please use the Q&A panel at the bottom of your screen throughout our session, whenever you feel like it, to share any questions, comments, etc. You might have for our discussants. And we'll pick those up again in our question and answer session after our 2 rounds of discussion with the panelists. Equally, should you experience any technical issues over the course of the session, please contact my colleague Linda, who might be waving right now, also using the Q&A panel at the bottom of your screen. Please also note that we'll be recording the webinar. And finally, a heads up to say that we'll be asking you for some feedback on the webinar at the close of the session. And Linda will provide the link to the feedback form we'll be using for that in the chat at the end of our discussion. And before I turn it over to our 4 discussants, let me just outline a few thoughts from our side on why we felt this discussion was crucial to be had right now. So basically the question is, why this event, right? Agricultural commodities such as sugar, palm oil, soy, etc., as we know, are essential for global population with growing demands. And at the same time, industrial agriculture has been found to contribute to several forms of environmental degradation, including water and air pollution, fish die-offs, diminishing biodiversity, etc. While the production of natural rubber, for instance, provides a livelihood for millions of people, it can also have severe negative impacts on the environment and the human rights of local communities and workers, if and when not managed responsibly and sustainably. Meanwhile, a healthy and sustainable environment is considered integral to the enjoyment of a wide range of human rights, as well as the fulfillment of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, particularly SDG 12 on the promotion of sustainable patterns of consumption and production. It's therefore essential to promote sustainable value chain governance by businesses And this is why we felt we needed a multi-stakeholder discussion on the obligation of companies, states, and other relevant actors in addressing environmental pollution in the production of agricultural commodities. And why this discussion now? Well, as you may well be aware of, this week is an important week for global policy making related to business, human rights, and the environment. The first part of the 5th UN Environment Assembly took part on Monday and Tuesday this week, while Monday also saw the start of the 46th session of the UN Human Rights Council. UNEA 5 this year focuses on SDG 12, on the promotion of sustainable patterns of consumption and production, with UNEP Executive Director Inger Andersen noting, I believe on Tuesday, that the common driving force between the triple planetary crises, namely climate change, nature and biodiversity loss, and pollution and waste, is humanity's unsustainable modes of consumption and production. Meanwhile, the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment will present his thematic report on human rights and the global water crisis to the Human Rights Council next week, in which he urges businesses to reduce water pollution, water use, and damage to freshwater ecosystems from business activities. And I believe you'll be able to find a link to that report in the chat panel in a little while. And our discussion today also comes on the day after Swedwatch, Source International, and Green Advocates International published a joint report on the environmental and human rights impacts of natural rubber processing in Liberia. And again, I believe you'll find a link to that report in the chat panel in a little while. So that's our motivation in a nutshell, really. We're extremely lucky to have 4 great discussants with us today to help us navigate this conversation. We're delighted, first and foremost, to be joined by David Boyd, who currently serves as the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment. David is also an associate professor at the University of British Columbia in Canada. So thank you again, David, for getting up early to make sure you could join us today. Our second discussant is Margaret Kran-Annexstein, who is a campaign director with Mighty Earth, a global campaign organization that works to protect the environment and stop human rights abuses, particularly in forest risk commodity supply chains. And Margaret also sits on the executive committee for the Global Platform for Sustainable Natural Rubber, where she helps guide the direction of the platform. And therefore, Margaret will act as our 2-in-1 today, both representing Mighty Earth and the GPSNR. Our third discussant is Mercy Anthony, who is a team member of the Natural Resource Women Platform, a Liberian civil society organization working to amplify voices of rural and urban women and design strategies to engage relevant stakeholders in addressing concerns about women's rights to natural resources. And Mercy was also instrumental in the recent research I alluded to before we conducted in Liberia on natural rubber processing. And last but certainly not least, Flaviano Bianchini is the founder and director of Source International, an international organization composed of scientists and lawyers who work with communities to provide evidence of pollution and human rights abuses by collecting scientific evidence on the environmental and health impacts of company operations, thus enabling local communities to engage governments and companies in negotiations or even legal actions. And with all of this said, enough from my side, and let us start our discussion and turn to our 4 discussants and ask them to share their thoughts with us. Well, I say their thoughts, but really it will have to be a summary of their thoughts, as I'm kindly asking them all to limit input to 5 minutes each, please. And so turning to our first discussant, David Boyd. David, in your forthcoming report to the Human Rights Council, which focuses on water pollution and water scarcity issues, I believe you urged businesses to contribute to and support efforts to ensure safe and sufficient water for all. Could you maybe share with us what the adverse impacts of water pollution and water scarcity on human rights are that you identified? And what do you see as specific obligations of states and responsibilities of businesses in terms of addressing water pollution and water scarcity? Thanks, David.
Well, those are big questions to try and answer in 5 minutes, Anna, so forgive me if I speak quickly. But, you know, folks, I think the first thing to really start off with is the big picture, right? Which is that we live on this beautiful blue-green planet where water is really the lifeblood of all life. Our bodies are made up of 70% water. And yet we're treating fresh water on this planet with reckless disregard. And so we live in a situation where the statistics are just almost impossible to comprehend. We have 2 billion people who don't have access to safely managed drinking water. We have 3 billion people who are facing acute or chronic water shortages. We have 4 billion people who don't have access to proper sanitation services. 80% of the water that is used by agriculture, by industry, by municipal wastewater systems is discharged into rivers, lakes, streams, and other water bodies without any treatment at all. And 3/4 of the natural disasters that we've experienced in the past 20 or 30 years have been water-related disasters. So floods, extreme weather events, landslides, droughts, etc. So there's no way that we can say this is anything but a global water crisis. And it's having its most dramatic impacts on people who are in vulnerable or marginalized situations. And it's having impacts on their human rights. It's impacting people's right to life. You know, as I mentioned earlier, waterborne diseases cause between 1.5 and 2 million premature deaths every year. It's having impacts on people's right to health. It's having impacts on people's rights to water and sanitation, their right to food, their right to live in a healthy environment. It's having impacts on the rights of children, and it's having impacts, obviously, on Indigenous peoples as well. And so, given this rather bleak outlook, I mean, we also today we're focused on the agricultural sector, and with good reason, because the agriculture sector consumes 70% of the water that's used by humanity. The agriculture sector is a major cause of water pollution right across the planet, whether you're talking about agricultural chemicals like pesticides, fungicides, herbicides, whether you're talking about fertilizers, or whether you're talking about vast volumes of manure from intensive industrial livestock operations. And the agriculture sector is also contributing to antimicrobial resistance, undermining the effectiveness of medicines by the reckless use of antibiotics in the livestock industry. So and agriculture is also a major cause of the decline of freshwater biodiversity, for example, by draining and filling in wetlands. So overall, we have a global water crisis in which the agriculture sector is a major factor. And so in my report, I set out the facts, I set out the impacts in kind of excruciating detail that the global water crisis is having on human rights right across the world. And then I set forth the state obligations and the business responsibilities. And Hannah, you summarized the business responsibilities quite nicely. Businesses need to use less water, which they can often do by using water more efficiently or by having closed loop systems for water in their processes. They need to stop polluting water. And again, that goes to the need for stronger state regulation and enforcement of those regulations, because many states do have actually good laws and regulations on paper with respect to pollution from industry, but it's simply a matter of those laws and regulations are not being implemented or enforced. And then in terms of the actual obligations on states, I have extensive detail in my report, but those are things like making sure there's inclusive, equitable, and gender balanced processes for the public to engage, making sure information is available in language and means that people can understand, all those types of procedural things, environmental impact assessments, human rights impact assessments. But also I lay out a really clear 7-point plan that all states should be employing to ensure that human rights are protected and fulfilled in the context of water. And so those 7 steps are: number 1, to prepare a state of the water assessment that looks at the water supply, water quality, sources of pollution, main water users, related land use activities, and the impacts on human health, human rights, and ecosystem health. Then second, a legal mapping initiative to ensure that the rights to water, sanitation, and a healthy environment are incorporated throughout water and wastewater laws, regulations, and standards. Third, to develop water-related plans to incorporate a rights-based approach. Fourth, to implement those plans and enforce water-related laws and regulations. And fifth, to evaluate progress and, where necessary, strengthen actions. And then 2 additional actions that have to be taken at every step of the process are to build human, financial, and institutional capacity. And secondly, to inform and engage the public, particularly women and other potentially vulnerable and marginalized groups. And if states really took those 7 steps seriously, I think we could go a long ways towards alleviating the global water crisis. And I can talk more about some of the solutions perhaps later on in the session today. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, David, for sharing that somewhat bleak overview of the global crisis facing us, but also offering up next steps and solutions. And like you said, we can delve more into that in our second round and later on in the discussion. But I would like to turn to you, Margaret, now, just having heard David speak about the global crisis, but also offering up the 7-step plan. How does that compare with your experience in your work with Mighty Earth, where you, I believe, develop and manage advocacy for the natural rubber program in order to pressure companies to clean up supply chains? Can you share some examples of your experiences and potential environmental and human rights impacts of business operations, in particular in the natural rubber sector?
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, Hannah. And thank you so much, David, for your overview as well. So at Mighty Earth, we work on a whole host of commodities that tend to have really serious human rights and environmental implications, and particularly when you think about the human right to health and to water, as David was talking about, we can see that a lot of these commodities have some pretty significant challenges. So particularly in our work on natural rubber, rubber plantations are a growing driver of deforestation, environmental destructions and pollution, as well as human rights abuses worldwide. So huge rubber producers are destroying the habitats of endangered animals, from orangutans and elephants, driving climate change because of their practices, and taking the land of often indigenous people who have lived there for generations for further production. Further, rubber production and plantation companies tend to dam up important waterways, fence off and destroy the land that people depend on to grow or forage food and medicines, and use pesticides and herbicides that run off into local waterways, causing some of that severe water pollution. And then after the rubber is tapped from the rubber plantations and the trees, the processing of rubber can also have really huge environmental and social impacts that we've seen. So this includes latex spills into fresh water, water pollution from the chemicals that are used on processing plants and are really common in rubber production, can lead to health problems and fresh water and food scarcity. Again, as David was speaking about. So structurally speaking, these corporate abuses are often driven by financial interests and sometimes even supported by greenwashing financiers. They're enabled also by corruption that can allow for businesses to conduct their business where it should not be, on either ecologically or socially important or sacred land. Further, weak or poorly enforced human rights and environmental laws in producing countries, as well as a lack of appropriate due diligence legislation in consuming countries, make it such that these challenges persist despite any initiatives to fix them. So we therefore need to set really high expectations and a level playing field through regulation, and in the meantime, push for voluntary accountability from these industry actors. So as you said, at Mighty Earth, we've conducted a number of investigations and run campaigns and advocacy initiatives to force them to be addressed. And we work really closely with our partners in countries around the world to call out examples of environmental and human rights abuses where they exist. So we've seen some really egregious examples of this environmental pollution in the production and processing of natural rubber. And so I have a few images to share here. Let's share my screen here. Oops.
We saw a brief teaser.
Okay. Okay, now do we see it again?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. So this is an image here from our work in partnership with a number of organizations in Ratanakiri, Cambodia, where a coalition of 5 civil society organizations, including Equitable Cambodia, Highlanders Association, Cambodian Indigenous Youth Association, Indigenous Rights Action Movement, and the Inclusive Development International. They've recently been calling out rubber company Hagel Agrico for its latest clearance in 2020, but has really had ongoing problems since 2014. So this is, one of the main issues with natural rubber production is deforestation. So between 2001 and 2015, nearly a quarter of all of Cambodia's national forests were lost, and a quarter of that was converted to rubber. And you can see here some images from that kind of land destruction. Hagel Agrico in particular as a company that's conducted land grabs and development on community lands, leaving people with limited access to water, fish resources, and has fenced off common land that's traditionally used for foraging of vegetables and medicines. I'll also comment, women tend to be disproportionately relying on common lands like this for these kinds of subsistence activities that are so critical. And so the point that David made about having a gender lens when we're looking at some of these issues is really important. This deforestation also leads to habitat and biodiversity loss. So we did a long investigation into Michelin's flagship Royal Lestari Utama project joint venture with Burrito Pacific in Jambi and Sumatra. And you can see images from that report that we released last September. This RLU project is supported by South Asia's first 95 million sustainability or green bond in 2018, and has been presented to global investors as a contributor towards Indonesia's national climate change targets. And we can see here that this is, an example of some of those structural issues that we're facing when this kind of forest destruction is described as part of a sustainability initiative. Unfortunately, our satellite analysis found that thousands of hectares of very precious tropical lowland rainforest, which is habitat to critical endangered species and really important to local communities, was industrially deforested by a subsidiary of Michelin's local partner in early 2015. So you can see here some pretty tragic images of the difference between that forest on April 4th, 2012 and January 5th, 2015. Local people complained that they were not consulted and that there were numerous reports of clashes and clearances and evictions. And today, even Michelin is making money from this destruction in Jambi and East Kalimantan, while local people are left without compensation. Another example of deforestation, in August of 2019, we did a report in partnership with folks in Cameroon on the Hevacam plantation that is owned by and under management by the world's largest rubber company, Halcyon. According to people who lived in this concession area, local surface water sources had become poisoned due to activities on the plantation. Things like pesticide runoff and spill from latex in the plantation have caused a toxic mixture of chemicals to enter local waterways. You can see here a picture of some of that pollution and the resulting illnesses and skin rashes that can be because of that. And community members from around the plantation blame this pollution on the numerous instances of water related illnesses and disease, including stomach aches, diarrhea, even several deaths, and blame this on the production happening on the Hevacam plantation. As we were getting ready to release this report in 2019, we actually worked really closely with the company, with Halcyon, to put together an agreement to ensure that human rights, better relations with the surrounding community, and restoration of deforested land would happen. And we really continue to monitor the situation and communicate regularly with the company to ensure that they are accountable to the commitments that they made and ensure that they respond rapidly when there are instances of pollution or latex spills on this plantation. So that has been a really big lesson, is the importance of communication and transparency there, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. But finally, the last report that I wanted to talk about was our report, A Bridge Too Far, that we published last year. Found that local people complained of water pollution and contamination of their rivers, creeks, and wells at a number of places near Firestone's rubber factory in Liberia. This is Firestone being a rubber plantation owned by the company Bridgestone USA. Locals said that there was pollution found at nearby towns and claimed that this was improperly treated wastewater from the factory that is on the Firestone plantation. The wastewater was untreated or not treated properly, and fishermen complained that the pollution left fish dead in nearby creeks and rivers. Local people complained of noise and air pollution from the factory. And these complaints from the Firestone factory have been made publicly by CSOs since, for a very long time. But unfortunately, even though Bridgestone did admit to us in a meeting that the wetland wastewater treatment plant had not reduced the effluent discharge to within permit limits, they publicly rejected our claims of water pollution and concerns here, and you can see in the picture some examples of that pollution. And unfortunately, Firestone has crucially refused to publish their own regular water samples and testing, and as well as environmental impact assessments, which could be helping local communities assess the livelihood risks and ensure greater accountability. And that's why we at Mighty Earth are obviously so grateful for the great work that's been done by Source International and Swedwatch and Green Advocates, which has brought us here today. So I'll stop there, and yeah, thank you so much for the time.
Thanks so much, Margaret, for illustrating the various types of environmental harms and subsequent human rights impacts you've encountered in your work with Mighty Earth. And you've raised the case of Liberia, which is a nice little segue to our next panelist, Mercy. Mercy, can you hear us? I'm aware we've had some internet connectivity issues. If you're there, Mercy, I'd invite you to share with us how communities in Liberia have been affected by large-scale natural rubber operations. No, I don't. Mercy, are you there? I see you.
Are you getting me?
Yes, we're getting you, Mercy. Hi.
Hello.
Hi, Mercy.
Yeah, I will be presenting on the experiences communities affected by large-scale rubber operation in Liberia. So particularly, I'll be talking about fire zone, how fire zone has affected communities around the Orange Grove district.
Okay.
Next slide. Community members have suffered from water and air pollution, and they have complained that the pollution has affected their livelihood, their water and sanitation, and then their access to information. According to community members, Firestone Liberia built a factory on the Farmington River in 1937. And then, leading to this, they said the water was being polluted by Firestone. And this water that is being polluted, which is the Farmington River, is what the community depend on for fishing, for bathing, for cooking and washing. In 2005, local communities, local fishermen and women who lay baskets and throw nets claimed that Firestone were experiencing their fish and crawfish over the river. And then they also complained of the strong ammonia scent that is smelled in the air due to the air pollution. Community members were getting sick due to this pollution, and some were dying. And they believe that it is because of the pollution that Firestone were causing in the Farmington River. So the community members then decided to take this complaint to the local authority, and then the local authority, not having power in their hands according to them, said that the community should leave Firestone alone at the time. But the community decided not to just sit and just leave Firestone alone because they were experiencing the pollution in the water. So they decided to take the complaint to Green Advocate International. And when they brought the complaint to Green Advocate International accepted the complaint. And then there was an advocacy campaign that was done by an organized group in the community called CCAPAL, which means Concerned Citizen Advocacy for the Protection of Ancestral Land. They went on to do this advocacy, and this advocacy led to Firestone building a waste treatment facility in 2008. And they diverted the water from the Firestone, from the Farmington River to a wetland for Kran community. Next slide. So this photo is a pollution in 2005 with wastewater that was being directly discharged into the Farmington River. As you see, anyone who come in contact with this water at this time will definitely get sick, because community members believe that at this time Firestone will dump the wastewater into the Farmington River, and then when community members go to lay basket or throw net and they come in contact with the chemicals, they will absolutely get sick. So this is an open thing that was done. Firestone was not hiding this. They were doing it openly because they felt that the community never had a voice to speak against them. But this was changed due to the advocacy campaign that was done by the community-led group and Green Advocates. And this wastewater was then transferred to the Kran community in 2008. Next slide. So here, this is a photo in 2008 where fishermen without fish, they abandon their baskets and their nets, because they complain that whenever they go to catch to lay their basket and throw net, they won't get fish at all. Some of them say that the amount of fish that they used to get from the basket and the net have reduced. And some of them, when they go to get these fish are either dead or living. And the few that are living are sold in the market. But then they complain that they are not getting fish as before. So most of them abandoned the fishing and decided to do something else. Next slide. Next slide. So this is a photo of the campaign that was done in 2005 with children holding placards against Firestone operation. and you can see the description there that says that give us a good environment, stop polluting our water, stop polluting our air. So little children were also affected because the children use the water to bath, the water is being used for drinking, the water is being used for cooking. So when the campaign started, children who were affected decided, and they were brought to hold placard to show the Firestone that this pollution is actually taking place, and then the link to stop polluting the water. Next slide, please. Next slide. Next, okay. So Firestone has actually affected the livelihood of the community members, especially women in the Orange Grove district, because the fact that the river is being polluted, and these fish that they take for the support of the family, and some of these fish are used for cooking. So according to them, they have no other source of income. That is the only place that they go to get fish from to sell. This is the place that our forefathers showed them that this is where we were able to get money to send people to school, to send our children to school. So they depended on this river solely for everything. But then, because they weren't getting enough fish from out of the river, it couldn't stop them from going there. They kept on going there because it is the only source of livelihood for them. Next slide. This is a photo of the baskets that women lay in the river when they go to fishing. You see, there are so many of it, and these baskets are being abandoned by the women because most of the time they go to lay baskets, and when they go to retrieve the basket from the river, the basket is either sometimes you won't see fish in the basket. Sometimes there are fish, there are crawfish, but some of it will be dead fish. Next slide. Next, please. Next slide, please. Okay, in the background, you can see, as you see there, water sanitation of community in Firestone have already been affected, especially for women, children. Most communities have, some communities, they have hand pumps. Next slide. Water sanitation of community have hand pumps and wells, and then these hand pumps washing and bathing. But then these hand pumps and wells are not safe because the water, the Flaviano river flows into the wells, flow into the creeks, flow into the hand pumps of these communities. Because of this, we have to walk long distance to get safe drinking water. So the extent that some have to buy, according to one community member, some community members, some have to go to buy a sack of mineral water, our locally made mineral water, to buy the sack, bring it home for drinking. And this sack is something that has 30 bags in one sack, and then probably one person will have to drink 5 bags a day. So if there are 10 persons in the house, if there are 10 persons in the house, then it means that the sack will not last for the day. So women suffer, women complain that when we met and we talked to women in the 10 communities, and they complain of how they are suffering from skin diseases, they are suffering from running stomach and fungus between the toes, and according to them, it is caused by their constant connection to the water that is contaminated by Firestone chemicals. Some of these women also complain of how they are suffering from miscarriages, they are suffering from private part infection, and then they believe that it is because of their constant connection with water that are causing all of these things. But better still, women are still using this river for farming and for bathing and fishing. An example is basket laying. Next slide. So this is a conversation with women on the basis. And as you see there, women feel ashamed to express themselves in the presence of their husbands and their brothers. So we have to use a strategy to take aside to talk to them and hear what are the issues that they are faced with and how can they be able to open up to us. So we discussed about women, and it is within this conversation that women were able to tell us what was their problem, how the Farmington, how Firestone has affected their livelihood, their health, and their sanitation. Next slide. So access to information for community members, especially women. Women do not know how bad or how far the water is being polluted. Because if they have the information of the kind of chemical that is being thrown into the river, they will be able to stop themselves and their children from coming in contact with the Farmington River. But every day, families go there to fishing, to bath, to wash, and to drink. And we believe that if only women knew the kind of chemical that is being used by Firestone and the level of impact of that pollution of the air and water at Firestone, they will probably decide to move out of the community, or they will probably decide to find another solution. But because the information is not given to them, they don't have that much information as to how far or how bad the water is being polluted. They constantly go there to fish, to bath, to wash, and to drink. Next slide. So this is the Farmington River. This is part of the Farmington River, where you see kids swimming in the Farmington River with the factory behind at the back. And that factory, there is where you will see a pipe that is connected from the factory coming down into the Farmington River. And then this factory also is where the rubber is being boiled. So when the rubber is boiled, there is a pipe that is going upward that discharge the smoke into the air. When the smoke goes into the air, it goes according to the direction of the wind. So wherever way the wind goes, there is where the smoke goes. So every part of the Orange Grove district experiences this smoke. And when there is a smell in the air, community members are not able to eat. They lost appetite. Some of them, they have to vomit. Some of them, they complain of poor eyesight because of the smoke. But you see, as we see access to information, those women don't have that enough information that can help them to stop their children from swimming or drinking this water. So you see the children are there, they are swimming in the river and they are drinking the river because they feel that yes, the river is being polluted, but they don't know how bad it is. And so, because it is the only source of livelihood, so they just have to use the river for what they are supposed to use it for. Next slide. So this is an example of some crawfish that were caught in the Farmington River that community claims that were caught already dead. Next slide. So what have we done as an organization? We have collaborated with other organizations like Green Advocate and Alliance of Real Democracy to help the affected communities. We have organized the affected communities and then build their capacity and raise awareness of the ongoing challenges they face at Firestone. We have helped document their challenges in storage through workshops and field visits. We have also collaborated with international partners like Source International and Swedwatch to help build science to prove community claims about the pollution of the air and water at Firestone and the impact on local communities, especially women and children. Next slide. This is a water sampling that was done with Source International and Swedwatch. Next slide. Yeah, so this is a monitoring of the air with Source International and Swedwatch. And you see in the background there are women using the river for washing. And so there is no way that they can escape this water. This water is the only source of livelihood for them. It's the only water that they can get safe drinking water from. That is the only water that they use for washing the bathroom. So with all what is happening, women are still using this water to wash. Next slide. Our biggest challenges in trying to uncover the extent of environmental pollution. Well, we have the lack of access to information is our biggest challenge. Like the affected communities, we also have no access to the environmental assessment, EIAS, the environmental management plans, and the quarterly reports that person is expected to produce and submit in keeping with the condition of the environmental permit. We also have no access to the regular fee monitoring or compliance report that is being prepared by the EPA to show that person is complying with the condition of the environment permit. We also request on behalf of the affected communities to the EPA. For surprisingly, the EPA doesn't respond to these requests, and so we don't have access to these reports and documents. This is the end of my presentation.
Thank you very, very much, Mercy, for lifting the voices and experiences of the communities in Liberia so powerfully. And I'm also glad the internet connectivity was fairly good to us. It was a good game plan, Mercy, to have you do your input in one go right now, knowing that potentially later on the internet connectivity will get a bit worse. So thank you so much for that, Mercy. And having heard all of this now, turning to you, Flaviano, having heard what Mercy describes that communities have complained about in terms of water and air pollution, what did you find when you were in the area conducting research, conducting water and air sampling, in terms of the complaints we just heard by those communities about water and air pollution? Did you find any evidence of this, and what do the findings mean for the communities affected? Thanks, Flaviano.
Well, first of all, hi to everybody. And yes, so both the communities and other organizations like Mighty Earth were highlighting the concern of air and water pollution caused by the rubber operation in the area, which we remind here it contains two different types of activities. There is the rubber plantation, which is one, and then there is the rubber factory that they produce rubber and they have some chemical process in it. And there are basically two different types of impact. And the rubber plantation is actually the biggest rubber plantation on Earth, the biggest contiguous rubber plantation on Earth. And it basically Firestone has the license over the 10% of the arable land of Liberia, which, as David Boyd reminded before, agriculture is a big impact. So imagine to have, as a big impact on water, imagine to have 10% of your arable land just in one big, huge rubber plantation. And then there is the second part. This rubber is collected and then is processed in the factory of Firestone, which is in the city of Harbor, very close to the town of Owens Grove. And the first thing that everybody is complaining, and everybody has been there, complaining, is the smell. The smell is awful. And I have been for my work, I've been in the most polluted places on Earth, but never heard something like that. Never had that experience to get headache after a few hours just for the smell. So, but that's, you can feel the smell, but how do you measure? So we ended up with measuring basically this smell with an instrument called Odorimeter, which is exactly something that can measure the intensity of the smell. And you can see on this graph that the point close to the factory where the rubber is processed, is where the smell is much higher than, as you can see up here on the top right, is much higher than any other point that we measure. And this is probably due to a mixture of various components. So we also measure the total volatile compounds that are basically a mixture of organic compounds that can be released during this process. And as you can see, they are pretty strong all over those communities. They live northeast of Firestone. You have to imagine that this is the Farmington River and the ocean is down on your southwest. So especially during the afternoon when the breeze from the ocean came, it brings all those fumes from Firestone factories to all those communities where there are hundreds, even thousands of people living. And we also measure, so still related, the PM10 and PM2.5. And we realized that in the point of D1 in Owens Grove, which is a community of a few hundred people just in front of the factory, the concentration of PM10 in the air were over the limit in every single day that we measure, with a peak on the end of February, beginning of March. And also the PM2.5 were over the limit or close to the limit in the first week, and then over the limit in the last few days. When you move a couple of kilometers northeast, you still have the impact of PM10, but they are slightly lighter, slightly lower than close to the factory. And you have to imagine that this is an agricultural area, a rural area where the main source of PM pollution, particulate matter, is 99% due to the factory because there's no other major impacts. What are those particles? Just to measure, this is a hair, a human hair. This is the dimension of those particles. So they are, again, composed by several different components. The peculiarity of those particles is that they goes into your lungs. The PM10 stops on the upper respiratory tract, but the fine particles of PM2.5 goes to the lower tract, so to the lungs itself. There is also another particle, which is PM1, that we were unable to monitor because of the instrument and the situation that we were. But they are even more dangerous. And we, as Margaret already said, there is a total lack of transparency. We don't even know if Firestone have ever measured those PM10, PM2.5, PM1, odor, all of these aspects, and they should have the instruments to measure even PM1. So after that, we go to the second things that most of the people complain in the area, which has already been listed by everybody today, by David, Margaret, and Mercy, about water. So I will show you a couple of pictures more. This is a small map of the area, which is the town of Harborville, so Harbel, basically, which is actually kind of interesting because the name of the town, and that says a lot about the importance of Firestone in the area. The name of the town, it came from Harbert and Isabel. Harbert Firestone is the founder of Firestone. Isabel was his wife, so they mix Harbel. That's the name of the town, just to say how strong is the presence of Firestone in the area. And this is the Farmington River that we have seen in several pictures of Mercy, which is for a lot of people the main source of water, especially during dry season. This is the small village of Owens Grove. And here on top north, there is a small wetland which is used as a wastewater discharge by Firestone. So there is a treatment plant apparently here near Firestone, but then the water is piped to this wetland, where the wetland works as an additional filter to the water that is discharged by Firestone, and then goes to the Yorchu Creek, into the Yorma Lake, which is used to be a lake used for fishing. Actually, Yorma in the indigenous language means fish lake, and then at the end into the Firestone, the Farmington River again. And actually, this is the level of phosphates that are into those 2 points, exactly at the exit of the wetland, at the pipe, and then on the Yorchu Creek. And when those phosphates, together with the nitrates, are the main responsible for eutrophication of water. So basically, those are nutrients that goes into the water and make the algae explode, because they are kind of similar to fertilizers. So the algae explode, and there is the water becomes brownish, which is the black water that was referred before by the picture, I think, of Margaret. And that does not allow the lights to pass by, and therefore there's no oxygen, and plus the algae will consume all the oxygen, and at the end of the day is what it led to the die-off of fish that is being widely reported by local communities. And also, I mean, we have to keep in mind that a die-off of fish is not that then you cannot fish, you cannot have fun on Sunday when you go fishing on the lake. In Liberia, a die-off of fish means a die-off of the sole source of protein for local communities. So basically, there is malnutrition without fish in that area. And denutrition and malnutrition, which is something that we have seen when we were there extensively, I would say. And another, actually, analysis that we have conducted is about heavy metals. And heavy metals, here is iron and manganese in the creek. They are, again, way above the limit established by WHO for drinking water, and they are even above limit for water which is suitable for environment or for recreational use. And this is very relevant because those metals are residual, so they will stay in the water, goes into the fish, goes into the trophic chain, and at the end of the day ended up in the human beings. And sooner or later someone will absorb these metals, and they are a huge problem all over the world and also in Liberia. And they, from the creek, they basically goes all the way to the Farmington River, and we can see that from the map before, if you remember, the point A1 is on top, and then the point A3 is exactly close to the Firestone factory and Firestone facilities, and therefore it's clear from here that there is a responsibility for the presence of those metals in the water.
Thank you very much, Flaviano, for sharing that, again, fairly bleak overview of your findings and the results of the analysis. And turning it over to you again, David, having heard now the experiences in Liberia, but also the input from the other discussants, you know, I'm on the one hand quite tempted to pose very big questions to you again, but realize that might not necessarily be serving the course here. I'm just interested in your first input earlier. You hinted at possible solutions, right? And you spoke a bit again on the obligations of states and what could states and companies do. So in light of what we've heard just now, I wonder whether you could elaborate on that a wee bit, and potentially also link that to the global right to a healthy environment, for instance, and what kind of difference you believe that might make to the structural issues that we've been discussing today. And secondly, I'm just throwing it out there knowing that we're pressed for time, but listening to the conversation, I can't help but think of due diligence frameworks that are currently under development at the EU level, for instance. And I'm just wondering if you had any brief remarks on potential benefits of integrating environmental standards, for instance, in due diligence frameworks. But again, I realize I'm posing very big questions and I'm leaving you very little time to answer them. So anything you've got, David, thank you.
Thanks, Hannah. And I just want to say thank you to Margaret and Flaviano for the work they're doing on behalf of these communities, and in particular, a huge respect to Mercy for her very compelling presentation and for the courage to be an activist. It's not an easy situation in countries like Liberia for people who are defending the environment and defending human rights. So I tip my hat to Mercy, and thank you for the work you're doing, Mercy. You know, this is a story that's told in so many different ways in so many different places, and I think it's a classic example of the problems we have of inequality in our world, right? You have this huge multinational corporation that's extracting resources, extracting wealth from Liberia at huge cost to the people and the ecosystems of Liberia. And the challenge we face is, how do we hold the corporation accountable? How do we reduce this gross inequality? And it's a question, obviously, that we're struggling with, and it's a question that we struggle with because of the absolute power inequality that we're facing. We have these small NGOs that are up against this colossal corporate titan, and so we really do need to change the system in ways. And I think that, you know, years ago, the UN came up with the guiding principles on business and human rights, a voluntary framework. It's crystal clear at this time in the year 2021 that a voluntary system is simply not fit for purpose. It's not going to get the job done. So we really need to put some energy into the, first of all, the global negotiations that are going on regarding a treaty that would impose mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence on all corporations everywhere. And those treaty negotiations have been going slowly. We need to pick up the pace, and we need to reach a global framework that holds all companies accountable. I do think there is reason for hope in terms of, you know, France set a precedent several years ago with a new law on requiring corporate due diligence on human rights and the environment. That law is in the early stages of implementation, but it has really provided a beacon of hope and a precedent that other countries in Europe are now building on. And as you mentioned, Hannah, the European Union is now beginning to develop a due diligence framework for European companies. So that's something that could be tremendously helpful, because what we're seeing in this Liberian case study is a complete lack of accountability, a complete lack of transparency. And the difficulty we face is that in a country like Liberia, which, you know, for all of its natural beauty, for the wonder of the people who live there, has really weak government institutions. You know, the Environmental Protection Agency there is clearly not up to the job, up to the task of properly regulating these Firestone operations. They're not even able to get the information into the hands of the people who have a right to that information. You know, so I look at this situation, and there are human rights violations going on in the context of these Firestone rubber operations. There's violations of the right to information, violations of the right to public participation, violations of the right of access to justice, violations of the right to water, violations of the right to food, violations of the right to a healthy environment. But how do we hold them accountable? That's the challenge. The right to a clean and healthy environment is found in Liberia's environmental legislation. It's been there since 2003. But within Liberia, it's very difficult because of those broader political and economic problems to achieve that accountability. And that's why we need these institutions like the European Union, institutions like the United Nations that have power and resources to apply them in these local contexts to assist the local people and to prevent human rights violations. You know, a company like Firestone, they have the resources and the technical ability to treat every drop of wastewater coming out of that plant. And if there was a Firestone facility in Italy or the UK or in Sweden, they would be held accountable to fulfilling those higher standards. They would have to publish information. The government regulators would publish information about the air contaminants, about water contaminants, about water use, about all of these things. And it would be publicly accessible information. And we don't have that in the Liberian context. So that's why we need these international mechanisms, and we need to build the capacity. I mean, there needs to be capacity building of these institutions in Liberia. So it's a big challenge, but I think we have the technology to solve these problems. Firestone has the technology. They could put scrubbers they could prevent the air emissions. They could clean the effluent before it's discharged. They're simply not doing that. And to me, that's a gross dereliction of their moral responsibility to the people of Liberia, which is inexcusable, but holding them accountable is very challenging.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, David, for that incredibly strong message. Flaviano, maybe in response to David's observations, are there any recommendations to, you know, based on your recent work in Liberia, but also on previous work and experiences throughout your quite numerous investigations, are there any recommendations to companies, any good practice you would like to share here with us today?
Well, yeah, first of all, I mean, what David just said, it's, I mean, it's absolute. I mean, there's nothing to say. I remember once it was just him in New York, he was saying how many countries and have the human rights healthy environment inside their law, I think 170 something. You know the exact number, David, but they are
156 out of 193 UN member states. And
Yeah.
in some of those countries, it makes a difference. Like if you look at a country like Costa Rica, it has made a huge difference in the quality of people's lives. But then you have a case like Liberia where the institutions are just too weak to implement these human rights frameworks.
Yeah, so you have plenty of countries that has this, but then you have a lot of those countries, not all, but a lot of them where there is no enforcement. But at the same time, Firestone is an American company owned by a Japanese company, and in both countries, when they operate in the US and in Japan, they use the best technology they have to avoid pollution. And if I remember once I was in a conference when Kofi Annan was saying, you don't need a law to know that you don't have to pollute the water of a community. You, international company, you know that you don't have to pollute the water of the community. And you cannot take advantage of the fact that nobody's enforcing you and saying, well, we know actually what they say, that it's, yeah, we knew that there were some pollution, but nobody complained. That's not how it should work in 2021. And obviously, I will not go into the details, but there are technologies to reduce the fume, to reduce the pollution in the air, to reduce the PM10 and PM2.5, to reduce the water pollution. There are plenty of technologies. The point is that, in order to maximize profits, you leave the liabilities. And I remember there was this huge polemics when Trump became president of the United States. The company asked for the regulation. They didn't ask for the reduction of salaries. Their big savings was to ask to the regulation of environmental enforcement and environmental standards. And that's all over the world, And unfortunately, there is a sort of a race to lower the environmental standard in order to attract foreign investment, and companies take advantage of this, despite knowing and having the technology to reduce this.
Sorry, speaking of the role of the companies, Margaret, I'd like to turn it over to you and this time speak to you as the member of the executive committee on the global platform for sustainable natural rubber. So when you hear these calls and recommendations to businesses, what is your response from your perspective and the GPSNR's perspective? What are the challenges facing businesses, in particular in the natural rubber industry, and what are the efforts the GPSNR is potentially undertaking to try and clean up the supply chain? Are there any good practices that are being recommended? Any thoughts, anything you could share with us on those elements, Margaret?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So I think that big picture in the natural rubber industry, some of the biggest challenges are around transparency and traceability of the supply chain. And these are huge challenges for due diligence in the rubber industry. And some of this is because rubber value chains are very complicated and involve many actors. And some of this will also take some technical solutions. But I also believe that a lot of this is about just taking the leap of faith and being ambitious and collaborating. Some of the challenges that supply chains pose, it just means that this transparency and public reporting are even more important if companies are serious about cleaning up their supply chains. And I know a big theme of a lot of my fellow discussants has been around this importance of transparency and access to information. So I think that for this collaboration to work and for initiatives like GPSNR to be successful, companies can do things like publicly disclose their environmental impact assessments, publicly disclose the testing that they're doing, publicly disclose even who their suppliers are. And This is something that's really been done in palm oil, which is another commodity that we work on in Mighty Earth. And this has been really important to identify and be able to monitor jointly and collaboratively with other companies to track where there might be high risks of environmental or social damage. And I think with the right level of ambition, this can happen really soon. This kind of joint industry monitoring of issues can happen through initiatives like GPSNR. And I think, aligning on some of these goals and these big picture solutions, we just need to a lot of times we have those goals. We just need to have alignment on the level of ambition and what it will take to get there. So I think to speak briefly about what GPSNR is, just for folks who may not be familiar, GPSNR is an international multi-stakeholder initiative formed to lead improvements in the socioeconomic and environmental performance of natural rubber value chains. And it can help companies with the tools and the initiatives that they will need in order to meet this demand for sustainability. So increasingly, we see that sustainability is an expectation of consumers. It's an expectation of investors and policymakers. And so in addition to these voluntary commitments that companies can make, there are moves for transparency and accountability through due diligence, as my colleagues were speaking about, and David mentioned some of the duty of vigilance laws in places like France. But until some of these laws take hold, and in order for companies to get ahead of the curve here, organizations like GPSNR can help align some of our priorities and help companies with the tools that they need to be able to implement those due diligence laws. And I think what's really important is that we get on the same page about what some of these priorities are. And I'll just share quickly, here's a slide on the founding member principles for GPSNR, and what we've agreed are the principles that we're trying to seek in GPSNR. So some of the big accomplishments that GPSNR has achieved so far, and kind of what we've learned about that. So in 2020, GPSNR members voted to adopt a set of sustainability policy requirements for all members. What this means is that now 50% of all traded rubber is covered by those commitments. So that is definitely a huge accomplishment. However, those words and those policies on paper need to be backed by action. So this year, we're focusing on development of implementation guidance for those policies, reporting requirements, and a model to ensure that these commitments are being followed. And so as part of that, we're also getting ready to launch our grievance mechanism such that communities can file formal complaints against companies that are not living up to the GPSNR member requirements. Another thing I'll highlight in answer to how organizations like ours and companies can kind of work with workers and associations of people on the ground, which I think is one of the questions in the chat, is GPSNR is a multi-stakeholder initiative that includes smallholder farmers. So natural rubber, while plantations provide some of the biggest environmental challenges, rubber has a huge amount of rubber that's produced by farmers who just own a few hectares of land that they're growing their rubber on. And I think that collaboration between the folks that are actually doing the work on the ground and the companies that are profiting from their rubber is really, really critical. And it's something that we've prioritized at GPSNR in order to bring stakeholders together and to co-create these solutions, as well as take accountability for past pollution and human rights abuses and the abuse that smallholders have also faced. Further, in further answer to that question, we at Mighty Earth have also been in touch with some of the labor unions that are part of Firestone, and we've talked to them a little bit about some of the ongoing work at GPSNR and what some of their recommendations might be. When we were talking to some of those unions, we identified that they are complaining of issues around their pensions and their contracts and the collective bargaining agreements at Firestone. So I think it's really important to incorporate their considerations as well as we think about solutions kind of at the plantation level and the global level. So just to wrap up with a couple of just best practices that I think we've learned through some of our work at GPSNR. And actually, I think we have a poll that I'd just like to quickly get a sense, because I think that some of the challenges that we face as a platform and as an industry and as a collective group of folks who are working on sustainability, we face a lot of similar questions. So whether you work in the natural rubber industry or not, I think that there are some similar things that we can all agree are challenges. And so I wonder if we can just pop up the poll, because I'd like to get a sense from the audience of what you all think some of the biggest challenges in your work are, whether or not they are issues related to rubber. And some of the things that I think we've taken away from our work in GPSNR are related to a few of these. So give folks just a quick second to take the poll.
Yeah, results are coming in. I'll just give it another 30 seconds, so at least we've given people a full minute to respond to this.
We cannot vote. This is not, host and panelists cannot vote. This is correct.
Unfair.
Unfair, I feel.
Such is the unfairness of Zoom, the Zoom world that we live in.
To make a complaint, Zoom.
Express your
Formal
grievance.
Exactly.
Okay, I'll just end the polling at this point and share the results.
Great. Cool. So this is very interesting, and I think very in line with some of the challenges that we've seen at GPSNR. So I would say, first and foremost, something that we've tried to do at GPSNR is build in transparency as the norm so that everyone knows what is expected and so that accountability can be achieved. So I see 63% of participants said that this lack of transparency, whether that's governmental, organizational, or corporate, is a really big challenge. So throughout GPSNR, we've really tried, and it's a big priority for us, to encourage that transparency through the grievances that we might receive, through the transparency and traceability of supply chains so that we can work together and enable true cross-industry collaboration. I would say so many of the issues that we're facing can't be resolved in isolation, but need that value chain wide initiatives. And by everyone knowing what some of the challenges are and where those lie in the supply chain, we can work together to solve them. I would say this is also just critical, and as we've said over and over in this webinar, that this is crucial for accountability, and that is something that is a really big priority, is the actual resolution of human rights and environmental abuses when they happen. Another thing, a best practice that we've learned through GPSNR is setting ambitious goals. And really coming to alignment on those. So I can see this is the second most popular answer to the poll. We found that setting ambitious goals around policies and specifically time-bound implementation plans are really, really important, and seeking alignment around those so that we can move forward with the same end in sight. So we often, folks at GPSNR, we are a really multi-stakeholder platform. So as I said, we include civil society organizations, companies throughout the supply chain, smallholder farmers, and we often have similar values with the idea that we want to work towards a more sustainable world. But we need to have that positive conflict and come up with solutions and be able to push each other to be as ambitious as possible. The next thing that I would say is that it's really important to prioritize and center the voices of the most marginalized and impacted or vulnerable actors in every aspect of the work of a multi-stakeholder initiative. This is so that we can be working towards sustainability and ensuring that there is accessibility of the benefits of the policy. So if we're going to be supporting sustainability, how do we make sure that the benefit of a sustainable product is being passed all the way up to the smallholder level, or the tapper level, or the workers on the plantations? How do we make sure that everything is going to be accessible, whether it's a grievance mechanism or a service, in order to build towards that equity and make the biggest change possible? And I think coming from this orientation of prioritizing and centering and listening to the voices of those who are most impacted by the challenges will help us to align our goals and ensure that, also the technical expertise where that is a problem. As I agree with the people on this call that the technical solution is not the biggest challenge. We have a lot of those. We just need to figure out how to make sure that they're being implemented in a way that is centering, again, the needs of the most vulnerable actors in the supply chain. And then the final thing I'll just say is that I think that building trust with partners, civil society, and suppliers is really, really important. Building that trust, that we're all working towards solving the same problems, but also trusting that we'll hold each other accountable for actions that are not in line with those values. So we've really prioritized that trust building, both that we can have conversations and constructively trust that we're working towards the same thing, but also know that at the end of the day, where there are egregious violations of human rights abuses and environmental harms, that we as the civil society caucus, we as partners in the supply chain are going to hold each other accountable because we don't have any time to waste in solving some of these big problems.
Thanks so much for that, Margaret. And you mentioned the magic word there, which is time. I am very conscious of the fact that we've got about 8 minutes left in our discussion today. So what I'd like to do now, given that remaining time frame of 8 minutes, is I just like to invite all the discussants for some final remarks, like a action point you'd like us all to take home. Any of the, what would you like to offer? Any reflections, any comments on any of the questions that were posed in the Q&A box throughout our session today? If there's anything you'd like to send us home with, now is the time to share. And maybe I'll be abusing my role as moderator just slightly in highlighting a question on conflict sensitivity that was included in the questions in the Q&A panel, just relating to Liberia, for instance, being a conflict affected country, and inviting any thoughts you might have on the role of business operations in increased social conflict, and whether you see a need for also a conflict-sensitive approach to business operations in addition to everything else we've discussed today. So I'd like to invite you to share your final remarks now. Maybe David, starting with you, if that's all right.
Sure, Hannah, thanks very much. And
Thanks,
again, just to reiterate my gratitude to the Swedwatch and all of the other organizations for putting together this report and this panel. I think I want to close on a positive note, actually, and I want to talk about United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And this is a vision for the world in 2030 that is incredibly inspiring and ambitious. Ending poverty, achieving gender equality, achieving safe and sufficient water for all, climate action, biodiversity, life on land, life on water. It's an enormously ambitious agenda that all of the countries of the world have agreed to. And we can't put the burden for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals onto the lowest income states and the least developed countries. We really have to take leadership. And I know that the majority of the people on this call today are from wealthy nations in the West and the North. And it's our moral obligation to do more, to push for our governments to do more, to take action on achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. I mean, I don't think I'm speaking out of turn here to say we are not on track currently to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. We need a much greater push. We need much higher levels of investment. We need much higher levels of official development assistance. And so, it behooves countries like Canada, where I'm from, Sweden, where you're from, to do much more in terms of elevating the profile of the Sustainable Development Goals, raising the levels of official development assistance or foreign aid, and really focusing on achieving human rights through those investments, achieving the human rights to water and sanitation, which currently is clearly not being enjoyed by people in the vicinity of this Firestone operation in Liberia. And I think that if we really made this a priority, we could actually achieve incredible transformations over the next decade. You know, people look at the world today and think of it as a fairly bleak place because of the pandemic and the climate crisis. But the reality is that we have made incredible strides in recent decades in terms of life expectancy, in terms of reduced infant mortality, in terms of a much higher proportion of people getting an education. We've made strides in terms of gender equality, but we need to redouble those efforts, and we need really all hands on deck to do that. We need corporations. The big corporations have a role to play in that. And we have to stop putting profits before people. And I think that's a really important part of the solution is if corporations aren't going to do that voluntarily, then it's up to us as the people to make sure our governments put in place the rules, the regulations, and the institutions that can force governments to be all force corporations to be benefit corporations. You know, it doesn't make sense to me. We've got this new thing in Canada where corporations can become benefit corporations where they're legally obliged to provide benefits to a broad range of stakeholders instead of just shareholders. Well, why on God's green earth would we have anything but benefit corporations? Why would we want to have detriment corporations? I mean, it makes no sense to me. So I think we have the solutions at hand. We are living in a world of incredible wealth. It's just that the inequality is preventing us from achieving things like the Sustainable Development Goals. So thanks for having this event, and thanks for educating me about the situation in Liberia. It's been a real eye-opener.
Thanks so much, David. Margaret, can I maybe turn to you and then close with Flaviano, because I think we're having internet connectivity issues with Mercy. So Margaret, can I invite you? Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that ultimately, I very much agree with David that if companies aren't going to do this voluntarily, we need strong regulation and institutional requirements that require all companies to be looking for the benefit of the public good and supporting the people who are part of their supply chains and the people who live in the places where they are doing business. I think this is critical, and we're very big supporters of some of the due diligence legislation that's happening in various countries. I'll also say on kind of a technical solutions note, I noticed one of the questions in the chat is around understanding rubber and if rubber is necessarily a terrible commodity. And I'll just say that, one thing that we've done a lot of research also at Mighty Earth is on agroforestry solutions to natural rubber production. So natural rubber can be grown sustainably through these agroforestry systems where not just one monoculture crop of natural rubber is grown, which often happens by clearing land first and then replacing those old forests with a monoculture crop, but instead to be growing multiple different plants, which can mimic the canopy cover of a natural forest. It's obviously not the same, it's not a replacement, but it can be a way to sustainably grow rubber where it could be grown. So this is something that's particularly useful because it provides that kind of climate change mitigation by mimicking an old growth forest. It can allow for more biodiversity and protection of the animals and that live there. They can also be production for other kinds of crops, other food crops or anything else that might be supportive to the communities that are living around the plantation or smallholders who are growing agroforestry farms themselves. And this can provide alternate sources of income as well as subsistence. This also allows for fewer chemical fertilizers to be used, which can lead to decreased runoff into waterways. And so kind of on a less big picture, but on a really meaningful sustainability note, agroforestry can be a really big way to be a safe alternative to some of these really challenging and devastating things that we see happen on monoculture plantations.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Margaret. And Flaviano. It's 5:30. You've got the final word.
Normally, I'm always like everybody and then a positive note, and I'm always the one to bring it down to something very negative. And so maybe I'll leave with this positive aspect and maybe just a message to everybody that everybody can do its part. And as David said, we had to force government and company accountable, and we cannot wait that is the one next to us who do it, because if everybody is waiting that is the next guy, nobody will do it and yet. So just, you know, first time I finished with something positive, I think, in my 15 years career. Not just.
And we'll take pride in bringing that about. It's a positive change. Well, wonderful. I like ending on a positive note, and let me just add my positivity to it and just thank all of you enormously for today, but also the collaboration with all of our discussants and panelists, and of course to all of our participants who stayed for today's interesting conversation. I look forward to being in touch with you all very soon. And if there's any questions, don't hesitate to get in touch. There'll be a thank you message to all of our participants today that you can then respond to, and we can continue the conversation that way. On that note, thanks so much, and have a wonderful evening, day, rest of the morning, wherever you are. Thank you all.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you all so much.